everyone, this is Amy Johnson-Crow, and welcome to this week's Archives.com live stream. This week, we are going to be talking about what are you missing in the 1920 to 1940 censuses. And we have a lot to cover today, so let's go ahead and get started. Now, the censuses are awesome. We use them so much in genealogy because they give us the household all together. So we're seeing lots of great things like the relationships, we're seeing the ages of people, we're seeing marital statuses. It's a great way to put a family together in one fell swoop, so to speak. But we tend to concentrate on this particular section of the census, where it's listing the names and the relationships and the ages and the marital status. So while the census is awesome, it's also very wide. And it's this rest of the census that we don't think about when we're going through these census records. We don't think about all of these things that are over here on the right-hand portion of the census. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. So today we're going to be concentrating on the 1920, 1930, and 1940 censuses. And I want to start with looking at the top of the census and the left-hand side. And those are similar in all three of those censuses, in 1920, 1930, and 1940. So here is the top of the 1920 census. And again, it'll look very similar on 1930 and 1940. So if we take a look at this left-hand section, we can zoom in a little bit and we see that we're looking in Hall County, Georgia, and we're in the Gainesville district. So this is telling us exactly where we are on this page, exactly where we are in this county. Now, there's also an area here for name of institution. So if the census was covering something like a prison or a hospital or an orphanage, the name of that institution would appear right here on this line. And that's going to be very useful to you if you find one of your ancestors listed on that page and they're enumerated in that institution. That gives you a clue for further research to follow up. Hey, you know, if they're in this orphanage or they are in this prison in this particular census year, hey, I should really take a look and see if I can find the records of that institution. Moving on to the middle part of this top section, and it's showing us the exact name of the incorporated place. In this case, we're actually in the city of Gainesville. And it's also giving us the date that this group of people were enumerated. Even though the census date was for 1920, I believe was the 1st of January, the census taker didn't get around to this section of town until the 9th of January. And then over on the right-hand section, we will have the supervisor's district, the enumeration district. If it's in the city, it will give you the ward of that city, and then it will number what sheet you're on. And you want to take note of all this information so that you can find this information again later. It's not enough to say, oh, I found them in Hall County, Georgia. Well, it's a pretty big place. But if I know that I found them on sheet 6A of Enumeration District 102, that's really going to narrow it down if I go to look for this record again. And also be sure to take a look at the name of the enumerator. I have a colleague who was going through a census one time and looked at the name of the enumerator, and it was actually her ancestor. So that was really, it was a great surprise for her. She had no idea that her ancestor was actually a census taker. And looking at the left side of these three censuses, we will find the street name, the house number, meaning the address, the household number, and the family number. Now, the street name is that very first column, and it's going to be written top to bottom. So you're going to have to kind of turn sideways to see the name of the street. In this case, we have North Green Street. And what the census taker would do, they would mark lines where they would begin and end a street. So all of these houses here between these lines are on North Green Street. The next column is actually the house number or the address. So the McConnell family lived at 33 North Green Street. If you're looking at a census that's out in the country, it's not uncommon for this column to be blank because it's just been fairly recently that houses had to have a number. So don't be surprised if that column is blank. The next two columns are the household and the family number. First is the household number, and that would be just where the census taker would number the households in order. There's no special meaning to it, it's just a sequential number. The family number is often different than the household number. The household is basically going to be encompassing everyone who is in that house. It's the entire household. But you can have multiple families in one household. So you will sometimes see entries like this, oops, back up here, where we have 36 Academy Street. It's household number 96, but we have two families, the Wallace family and the Newman family. And it's just that the census taker recognized that it was two separate families living in the same household. Now, 1920, we have some information that tends to get skipped over when we're looking at the census, like home ownership, naturalization, birthplace, parents' birthplace, native language, and occupation. Let's take a look first at home ownership. You know, we tend to concentrate again here on this left-hand side, and we take a look a lot at the names and the relationships, but this very next section is telling us about home ownership, and it's asking if the home was owned or rented, and if it's owned, was it free or was it mortgaged? And what we see here is that all three of these households were actually renting the house where they were living. Now, not only is it interesting to take a look at that for your family, but take a look at the neighborhood. See what everyone else is doing. Did they own their home, but yet most of their neighbors were renting? Or were they typical like we have here where everyone is renting? So take a look at the other families on that page, the previous page, the next page, just to get a feel for that neighborhood and see how they fit in. Were they typical or were they different? The 1920 census also asked questions about sex, race, age, and marital status. And most of the abbreviations that are used in column 10, color or race, are pretty much self-explanatory. One note about the instructions that were given to the census takers is that African Americans who were determined to have, who were determined to have any amount of white blood were supposed to be enumerated as mulatto. So you will see differences in how race is recorded from one census to another. That's not unusual to find. Citizenship. Here in the next section of the 1920 census. And if the person was not born in the United States, they were supposed to give the year that they arrived in the United States and then their citizenship status. So if they were listed as AL, that meant alien. They had not taken any steps at all to become a U.S. citizen. And A, that we see down here, means that they are naturalized, and they're supposed to give the year that they became a naturalized citizen. Sometimes you will see the abbreviation PA, meaning that they had filed their first papers. They had filed what's called the Declaration of Intent, but they were not yet naturalized. They were still going through the process. And it's important to note that the instructions that were given to the census takers in 1920 was that a married woman was to be reported with the same citizenship as her husband. So it's actually not unusual to find a woman listed as perhaps an alien, even though she was born in the United States. And that's actually what we see here in this example here. The section on education in 1920. Very, very basic information, whether they had attended school and whether they could read and whether they could write. Now, this doesn't mean that they could read and write English. They were actually supposed to say yes to any language. If they could read any language, if they could write any language. So it wasn't limited to just English. Now, those were the instructions. Whether or not that's how the question was communicated might be a different matter. Nativity and mother tongue takes up a great portion of the 1920 census. So we're seeing the place of birth and what they're calling the mother tongue, or the native language of that person, the person's father, and the person's mother. And this can give us very good clues about origin when we take a look at mother tongue. For example, this person here was born in Poland with a notation after it, Austria, but their mother tongue was Polish. Now, if later records list that they were born in Austria, we might think that their native language was German. But what we're seeing here, what we're seeing here is that it's not the German-speaking portion of Austria that they came from. It was that other portion that got separated off later as part of Poland. So again, taking a look at what the native language is of that person can give us very good clues about their nativity. And then occupation. So we will see the trade or profession that they do and what industry it's in. And then there's a column over here to tell what type of worker they were. So were they an employer? Were they a salary or wage worker? And both salary and wage workers are denoted with a W, such as this barber who had his own shop. He was self-employed. He worked on his own account. Now, the 1930 census looks a lot like 1920, with a few variations. For example, there's a little bit different information about housing that we see here in home data. Not only do we see if the house was owned or rented, but we see the value of the home. If it was owned, what is the value of the house? Or if they're renting, how much did they pay in monthly rent? And again, this is a great way to compare your ancestors with their neighbors. You know, if everyone's renting, was your ancestor paying a rent that was similar to what their neighbors were paying? Personal information looks a lot the same. We have the sex, the color, the age at the birth date. But what I like is the question, age at first marriage. And you can actually get good clues from this. That age at first marriage, take a look at those ages and see if it's consistent with their current ages. So for example, here we have a husband and wife. He's age 37, she is age 38, so she is 1 year older than he is. And reported that age at first marriage, that he was 24 and she was 25. Again, she's 1 year older than he is. So that is consistent. Now let's say that it said that his age at first marriage was 27 and hers was 18. Well, that's a lot different than she being 1 year older than him, so that would lead me to believe that at least one of them had been married before. So compare that age at first marriage to see if that age difference is comparable to what their current ages are. Is it the same age difference between the two? And if not, you might have another marriage somewhere in the mix. More questions about mother tongue and citizenship. Again, this is in 1930, where we see the language spoken before coming to the United States, and the questions that we saw before. What year did they arrive? At what point in the naturalization process are they? And a specific question, whether they are able to speak English. And questions about employment. Besides occupation, we're seeing the question, were you actually at work yesterday? And there's also a section for veterans. So was this person a veteran of any military conflict? And there are codes. Again, when you see these codes in the veterans section, they're pretty much self-explanatory. But one important note about the 1930 census: the enumerators were told that persons in the military or naval service of the United States during peacetime only are not to be listed as veterans. So if your ancestor was perhaps in the regular army, but it wasn't during any of these military conflicts, they're not going to be listed as a veteran since they only served in peacetime. Now, the 1940 census is a lot different. Questions about education looks a lot different in 1940 than what we saw in 1920 and 1930. So the section on education asks whether they had been at school and what is the highest grade that they have completed. So if you just see a number, like we have down here, just the number 6, that would be the number of grade that they completed in high school. So these two people here, if I can get my cursor to work, there we go. These two people here with the 6s, that means that they had completed the 6th grade. Now sometimes you'll see an H with a number, that means high school. So if it says H2, it means that they had completed 2 years of high school. And the same for C, for college. C3 would mean that they had completed 3 years of college. Questions about birthplace and citizenship appear in the 1940 census. We have the person's place of birth, and again, we have what place they are in the citizenship process. All 3 of these people are listed as aliens, so they have not started the naturalization process. Unfortunately, with the 1940 census, we lost all of the questions about when did they arrive and if they were naturalized, when did they become naturalized? It wasn't asked in 1940, so we were missing out on some data in 1940 that we had seen with previous censuses. Now, the section that trips up people the most in 1940 is the section on residence, April 1st, 1935. They're actually asking, where were you living 5 years ago? And that's this middle section right here. and they were supposed to list the city, the county, and the state where they were living in 1935. Now let's say that they're living in the exact same house that they were. You know, they're living at 123 Maple Street in 1940, and that's the same house that they were living in 1935. That's when the census taker was supposed to list same house. Now, if it says same place, it means that they were living in that same town as 1940, but in a different house. So, this particular census is from Los Angeles. So these two people down here were living in Los Angeles in 1935, but in a different house. On other records, you will see, instead of a city, you'll just see the letter R and then a county and a state. That R means that they were in a rural area. Questions about employment and income in the 1940 census. There are so many questions that pertain to employment and income in 1940. We could spend this entire live stream just talking about this section of the 1940 census. So just be aware that there are a lot of questions. They're all up here at the top of the census. You can read them and see what they mean. And the codes that are used are listed at the very bottom of the census page. One question that I do like is this column here about income. Again, a great way to compare your neighbors, or to compare your ancestors with their neighbors, to see how comparable they were. You know, I like to compare people of similar occupations, you know, to see what yearly income that they had. Now, the 1940 census was the first one to ask additional questions to some people. So when you're looking at the 1940 census, take a look over on the left-hand side and see if your ancestor is on a line with this notation for supplemental question. And if he is, take a look at the very bottom of that page, because he was asked more questions. Take a quick look at some of these. It would ask about the birthplace of his father and mother and what his native language is. We also see information about veterans. Was this person a veteran, or was this person the widow or an underage child of a veteran? And it asks questions about that military service. Did this person have a social security number? And was this person receiving old age insurance? So the first time that we see social security on a census. A little bit more information about occupation, including the class of worker. Were they earning a wage? Were they working piecemeal? And again, the codes that are used to describe the workers are located at the very bottom of that census page. And for women who were married, it asked if she had been married more than once, what was her age at that first marriage, and how many children had she given birth to. Now, there are a lot of questions on all of these censuses. So I encourage everyone to go to this page at archives.com. This page is free for everyone at archives.com/1940-census-questions. And it doesn't have just the 1940 census. It has the questions for every U.S. census from 1790 all the way to 2010. Now, we obviously can't see the 2010 census yet, but we can go and see exactly all of the questions that were asked of all of the censuses. It's a great resource. Again, at archives.com/1940-census-questions. Next week on the archives.com live stream, Compiling what you find so it makes sense later. If you've been doing genealogy for any length of time, I'm sure that you've had the experience of going back to a file folder and looking at it and thinking, what in the world does this mean? I have no idea what these notes mean. I have no idea where this thing came from. So that's what we're going to tackle next week, compiling what you find so it makes sense later. That'll be next Wednesday, June the 5th at the same time, 1 p.m. Eastern, 10 a.m. Pacific. In the meantime, stay connected with archives.com, whether it's on our blog, our Facebook page, on Twitter, or on our YouTube channel, where you can see past live streams. For those of you who are watching live, I will be popping in over on the chat room to answer a few questions. And for those of you who are watching this later on YouTube, please stop by on Wednesdays at 1 o'clock Eastern, 10 a.m. Pacific, and join us. We have a great time over in the chat room answering questions and getting ideas for further research. So until next time, I'm Amy Johnson Crow, wishing you happy researching.